Johnny Carson read the letter. His hands started trembling. Tears filled his eyes. He stood up from his desk and said, "I need to leave the stage." No one knew he was keeping a promise to a dying 8-year-old child. It was March 1978. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. A Thursday night taping. The familiar rhythm of late-night television, monologue, commercial break, guest interview, comedy sketch, musical performance. America's nightly ritual before bed. Johnny was in the middle of his opening monologue. A joke about President Carter. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was chuckling at his desk. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready for the next musical cue. Everything was exactly as it should be. But on Johnny's desk, partially hidden beneath his blue cue cards, sat a white envelope that had arrived at the studio that afternoon. Hand-delivered by a woman who'd driven 3 hours from Bakersfield. The production assistant who'd accepted it had noticed the woman was crying. "Please make sure Johnny gets this tonight," she'd said. "Before the show. It's important." The envelope had been placed on Johnny's desk during his pre-show routine. He'd glanced at it, saw it was addressed in a child's handwriting, and had set it aside, intending to read it after the taping. Fan mail could wait. The show couldn't. But halfway through his monologue, something made Johnny pause. Maybe it was the way the envelope caught the stage lights. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something else entirely. He reached for it. The audience noticed a break in rhythm. Johnny Carson didn't pause during monologues. His timing was legendary, precise, honed over decades of performance. Ed McMahon shifted in his chair, sensing something was off. Johnny held the envelope, turning it over in his hands. Then, without explanation, he tore it open. The letter inside was written on lined notebook paper in careful, childish handwriting. Blue crayon. The letters were uneven, some larger than others, the kind of writing that comes from a hand that's learning or struggling. Johnny began reading silently. And everything in Studio 6B changed. Johnny Carson had received thousands of fan letters over 30 years, but none of them ended like this. He read it while tears streamed down his face, walked off stage, and left to keep a promise to a child who was dying. His face transformed. The professional mask, the one he'd worn for 3 decades, the one that never slipped, that maintained perfect composure through every interview and crisis, cracked completely. His eyes filled with tears. His jaw clenched. His hands holding the letter began to shake. Ed stood up from his desk, concerned. "Johnny?" Johnny didn't respond. He was reading, his eyes moving across the crayon letters, and with each line his expression grew more pained. The audience fell silent. 300 people suddenly unsure what they were witnessing. This wasn't part of the show. This was something else. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny finished reading the letter. He lowered it slowly to the desk, his hand resting on the paper as if he couldn't bear to let it go. Then he looked directly into camera 1. "Folks," he said, his voice rough, barely controlled. I need to stop the show for a minute." He turned to Doc Severinsen. "Doc, can you give us a moment?" Doc nodded, confused, and signaled the band to lower their instruments. Johnny looked at the letter again, then back at the camera. "About 6 weeks ago, I received a different letter. From a boy named Timothy. Timothy Walters. He's 8 years old. He lives in Bakersfield. And he's dying." The studio was absolutely silent now. You could hear the hum of the stage lights, the soft whir of the cameras, nothing else. "Timothy has leukemia," Johnny continued, his voice steadier now but thick with emotion. "He wrote to me and asked if I would visit him. Not because he wanted to meet a celebrity. He had a different reason," he said. Johnny paused, swallowing hard. "He said his parents were very sad all the time, and he thought if Johnny Carson came to visit, maybe they would smile again." Ed McMahon's eyes were wet. Several audience members were openly crying. I wrote back to Timothy, Johnny said. I told him I would come visit him. I promised. We set a date, this Saturday. I was going to drive to Bakersfield after the show tomorrow, stay overnight, and spend Saturday with him and his family. Johnny picked up the new letter, the one he just opened. This letter is from Timothy's mother. She drove here tonight to make sure I got it before the show. Timothy died this morning. He was 8 years old. A sob broke out from somewhere in the audience. Then another. Within seconds, half the studio was crying. Johnny's hands were shaking as he held the letter. His mother wrote to tell me that Timothy, in his last days, when he was in the hospital, when he was in pain, he kept asking if Johnny Carson was still coming to visit. And his parents would say yes, Johnny Carson promised, and Timothy would smile. He died believing I was coming. The control room was chaos. Producers were screaming into headsets. Director Bobby Quinn was trying to decide whether to cut to commercial. But producer Fred DeCordova held up his hand. Let him finish. Keep rolling. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny stood up from his desk. Not the casual standing he did during comedy bits. This was deliberate, purposeful. He looked at Ed, then at the audience. I made a promise to Timothy. And even though he's gone, I'm going to keep it. His mother wrote that the funeral is Saturday morning in Bakersfield. I'm going to be there. I'm going to meet his parents, his family, the people who loved him. And I'm going to tell them that their son was important enough to stop the Tonight Show. He turned to his producers in the wings. Cancel tomorrow night's taping. Move everything. I'm driving to Bakersfield tomorrow morning, and I'll be there through the weekend. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in that collective sound of 300 people witnessing something profound. Tears, gasps, the rustle of tissues being pulled from purses. Johnny looked back at the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave the stage now. Ed will take over. We'll continue the show. But I need to make some phone calls. I need to call Timothy's mother and tell her I'm coming. And I need to. His voice broke completely. I need a moment. He picked up the letter, carefully folded it, and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then Johnny Carson, who had hosted The Tonight Show for 16 years, who had interviewed presidents and movie stars, who was the king of late-night television, walked off his own stage. The camera stayed on his empty desk. Ed McMahon sat in stunned silence. Doc Severinsen had tears streaming down his face. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or cry or sit in reverent silence. Ed finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to take a break, folks. We'll be right back. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Timothy Walters was and why his letter changed Johnny Carson forever. Timothy had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia when he was 6 years old. For 2 years he'd fought with the kind of courage that only children possess, the courage that comes from not fully understanding death, from still believing in heroes and happy endings. He loved The Tonight Show. His parents, Greg and Susan Walters, would let him stay up past bedtime on special occasions to watch Johnny's monologue. Timothy thought Johnny Carson was the funniest person in the world. When Johnny laughed, Timothy laughed. When Johnny did his famous Karnak the Magnificent sketches, Timothy would try to predict the answers and would dissolve into giggles when he was wrong. In January 1978, when Timothy's doctors told his parents that the cancer had returned and there was nothing more they could do, Timothy had overheard the conversation. He'd understood enough to know he was dying, even if he couldn't fully comprehend what that meant. He'd asked his mother if he could write a letter to Johnny Carson. Susan had helped him compose it. Timothy's hands were weak from the treatments, so he'd written slowly, carefully, in blue crayon because it was his favorite color. The letter was simple. Dear Mr. Carson, my name is Timothy. I am 8 years old. I am sick and the doctors say I will go to heaven soon. My mom and dad are very sad. They cry a lot. I think if you came to visit me they would be happy again because you make everyone happy. Could you please come visit me? I live in Bakersfield. I promise I won't take too much of your time. Love, Timothy. Susan had mailed the letter not expecting a response. Johnny Carson received thousands of letters every week. Why would he respond to theirs? But 10 days later, a letter arrived. On Tonight Show letterhead. In Johnny's own handwriting. Dear Timothy. Thank you for your letter. I would be honored to come visit you. Let's set a date that works for you and your family. Have your mom call my office and we'll arrange everything. I promise I'll be there. Your friend, Johnny Carson. Timothy had carried that letter with him everywhere. To the hospital. To treatment appointments. He'd read it so many times the paper had become soft and worn. Johnny Carson promised. He'd tell the nurses when they administered painful treatments. He's coming to visit. I just have to hang on. His parents had called Johnny's office. His assistant had been kind, patient, and had genuinely helped arrange a date. Saturday, March 18th. Johnny would drive to Bakersfield, meet Timothy at home, stay for lunch, and spend the afternoon with the family. Timothy had circled the date on the calendar beside his hospital bed. He talked about it constantly. What would he show Johnny? His baseball card collection? Should he try to make Johnny laugh? Would Johnny do the Karnak voice? On March 16th, 2 days before Johnny was scheduled to arrive, Timothy had a crisis. His body was shutting down. The doctors moved him to intensive care. He slipped in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he asked about Johnny. Is he still coming? Did he forget? Mom, make sure he knows how to get to our house. He's coming, baby, Susan would say, holding her son's small hand. Johnny Carson promised. He'll be here. Timothy died at 6:47 a.m. on March 17th. He'd been unconscious for the final 3 hours. His last semi-coherent words had been, "Tell Johnny I waited." Backstage, Johnny made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood in his dressing room, the letter still in his pocket, phone receiver pressed to his ear. He'd called the number Susan Walters had written at the bottom of her letter. She answered on the first ring. Hello? Mrs. Walters, this is Johnny Carson. He heard her breath catch. Mr. Carson, thank you for calling. I'm so sorry. I know Timothy wanted to meet you. I know you promised. I wanted to tell you in person that you didn't need to come anymore. What time is the funeral? Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. But Mr. Carson, you don't have to. I'm coming. I made a promise to Timothy. The fact that he's gone doesn't release me from that promise. Where is the service? She gave him the details. First Baptist Church on Mill Creek Road. Small service. Just family and a few of Timothy's friends from school. I'll be there, Johnny said. And Mrs. Walters. I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. Mr. Carson. Susan's voice broke. Timothy died happy because he believed you were coming. That belief gave him peace in his final days. You gave my son hope when we had none left to give. You already kept your promise. Johnny couldn't speak. He nodded silently into the phone, tears streaming down his face. Saturday morning, Johnny Carson arrived at First Baptist Church in Bakersfield. No cameras. No press. No entourage. Just Johnny in a simple dark suit, carrying Timothy's worn letter in his pocket. He sat with the family. He held Susan's hand. He told stories about reading Timothy's letter and how brave he thought the boy was. After the service, he stayed for hours at the Walters home, looking at photos, hearing stories, making sure Timothy's parents smiled at least once that terrible day. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Johnny never spoke publicly about Timothy Walters. But he kept that blue crayon letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. And when young performers asked him for advice about fame and success, he'd tell them the same thing. The promises you make matter more than the shows you do. Remember that. Timothy's letter stayed with Johnny until his final Tonight Show episode in 1992. He donated it to his personal archive with one instruction. This is why the work mattered. A promise kept. Even to a child who would never know.